ladies, MBs and gentlemen. This video is a follow-up to the last video, Knowing Your Left from Your Right. In that video I did give some mention to political labels that people might apply to themselves or have applied to them by others. But in this video I'm going to focus on labels specifically. Unfortunately, political labels are a minefield of miscommunication, partly because they have taken on different meanings within different cultures, and partly because the same label may be equally applicable to two or more different schools of thought. There are also simply common misconceptions of what some words mean. More insidiously, there have been outright propaganda campaigns to tar and feather certain political identities, such as the accusation that the Nazis were socialists, as well as to rebrand certain political ideologies, such as modern fascists picking out new names for themselves, such as race realists. It doesn't help that we often take a very essentialist approach to political labels, i.e. simply asserting that they intrinsically mean certain things, ignoring the fact that, like all words, they are socially constructed. In the last video, where I outlined the basic differences between the different corners of the political square, I noted that both the libertarian left and the libertarian right identify as libertarians. And of course they are both identified by others as libertarians. However, they both mean something very different by this. The libertarian left desire liberty for the workers, i.e. the people in general. The libertarian right desire liberty for private business owners, i.e. a free market. Right libertarian Murray Rothbard openly gloated to having appropriated the word libertarian from the libertarian left. One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that, for the first time in my memory, we, our side, had captured a crucial word from the enemy. Other words such as liberal had been originally identified with laissez-faire libertarians, but had been captured by left-wing statists, forcing us in the 1940s to call ourselves rather feebly true or classical liberals. Libertarians, in contrast, had long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists, that is, for anti-private property anarchists, either of the communist or syndicalist variety. But now we had taken it over, and more properly from the view of etymology, since we were proponents of individual liberty, and therefore of the individual's right to his property. Rothbard's quote here is a good example of how political labels have a history of being squabbled over. For example, I also noted in the last video that both the libertarian left and the libertarian right often identify as anarchists. Anarchy literally means no rulers. As Flick puts it, the word anarchist comes from archon, meaning a ruler, and the addition of the prefix an, meaning without, creates the terms for conceiving not of chaos, not disorganization, but of a situation in which there is emancipation from authority. Both the words libertarian and anarchist are generally understood to refer to a lack of state. Broadly speaking, the libertarian left desire public control of means of production rather than private control or state control, and the libertarian right desire private control of means of production rather than public control or state control. As covered in the last video, capitalism, i.e. private control of means of production, requires the state to function. Specifically, a state is required to enforce private property rights. Even right libertarians such as Harry Binswanger accept this. As such, it's very, very difficult to tolerate the notion that capitalists are in any way, shape or form anarchists, and as such, I don't. As standard on this channel, if you hear the word anarchist, it is in reference to the libertarian left. I have similar reservations about right-wingers calling themselves libertarian. However, I accept that thanks to Rothbard and his ilk, the word is commonly understood in America to refer to the libertarian right. Indeed, Americans are often baffled at more European terms, such as libertarian socialism, considering it to be some sort of oxymoron.
But you want to talk about libertarian socialism?
Oh,
that is in and of itself impossible.
let me tell you, a libertarian socialist is the same thing as a heavenly devil and a kosher hog. It doesn't exist.
This is what happens when you're raised in a culture where you're constantly told that libertarianism refers to capitalism with little to no state interference, and that socialism refers to lots of state control over everything and everyone. I do also accept that there are notable differences between the authoritarian right and the libertarian right. However, I maintain that neither really offer liberty in the truest sense. So I argue that the word libertarian belongs in inverted commas when referring to anything right-wing. Typically on this channel, if the libertarian right are being referred to, they will specifically be referred to as the libertarian right, not as simply libertarians. There's a similar conflict between the libertarian left and the authoritarian left regarding the word communist. Both the libertarian left and the authoritarian left often call themselves communists. However, what they mean by this is distinctly different. The authoritarian left form of communism stems from Marx and Engels, who argued, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralise all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organised as the ruling class." By contrast, libertarian communism involves no state, but rather direct public control of means of production. To quote Kropotkin, "We are communists, but our communism is not that of the authoritarian school. It is anarchist communism, communism without government, free communism." Marx and Engels did of course argue that their proposed state would eventually wither away once it has served its purpose. However, as Rocker argued, in Russia, where the so-called proletarian dictatorship has ripened into reality, the aspirations of a particular party for political power have prevented any truly socialistic reconstruction of the economy and have forced the country into the slavery of a grinding state capitalism. The dictatorship of the proletariat, in which naive souls wish to see merely a passing but inevitable transition stage to real socialism, has today grown into a frightful despotism, which lags behind the tyranny of the fascist states in nothing. It should be noted that a number of left authoritarians refer to themselves as Marxist-Leninists rather than simply Marxists. Marxist-Leninism essentially refers to Marxism merged with Russian populism by Vladimir Lenin. More specifically, when Marx and Engels penned the Communist Manifesto, they had in mind a much more industrialised capitalist society than Russia. As such, Lenin sought to transform the then mostly agrarian Russia into such an industrial capitalist country, but under the auspices of a state rather than private owners, after which a stateless, classless, moneyless society would supposedly be implemented. I say supposedly because this promise has yet to be delivered upon by any Marxist-Leninist regime. On the contrary, money still exists in these societies, said money is still disproportionately distributed, and the state is stronger and more overbearing than ever. It isn't simply anarchists such as Rocker who refer to this as a grinding state capitalism. Lenin himself openly admitted that is what he and his party were implementing. Similarly, if we look at countries such as China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., none of these states show any signs of withering away. As such, authoritarian communism and libertarian communism in practice are distinctly different ideas, and arguably the word communist belongs in inverted commas when referring to the authoritarian left, given as the stateless, moneyless, classless society in which workers control means of production that they promised has never been delivered, and shows no signs of being delivered anytime soon. Worse, efforts by workers to assert direct control over means of production have been brutally crushed by Marxist-Leninist regimes. Something you'll notice about how the right use the word communist.
Communism is economic totalitarianism before all else.
The leaders of Russia tell us their only concern is the defense of their own nation. Is this so? Or are they ambitious for world conquest? Question. A question of communism. Ever hear of Karl Marx?
The left, and I'm talking about the left, not traditional liberals, like Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy, has never loathed communism. And since the left dominates academia, almost no one teaches communism's evil history.
Student government rejects pro-capitalism club, says it's against humanity to allow it. Communism, on the other hand, that's done so much for humanity. I think it's only killed something like 90 million people.
Joseph Stalin emerged as undisputed leader. Here was a new face, but in the background was an old one, Karl Marx.
You sit there with this smug look on your face, and you think you've got this high moral high ground that you have, when in reality you haven't, because you're into communism, you're into socialism, and like I've shown before, you've got Stalin who killed between 20 to 25 million people.
You will not get freedom under communism, because there are no rights, there are only duties and entitlements. They have been preordained for you by a group of people who are not accountable to you.
As we know, leftists lean towards socialism, big government programs, and equality of outcome, which is why they have sympathies towards communism. And Che Guevara and Fidel Castro didn't do nothing in their eyes.
And you seem to forget that the left has its fair share of dictators too, as well as, Fidel Castro, Lenin, Stalin, those types of people. Those people that killed millions of people. What should happen to people like you? You should be made to live under a communist regime and experience it for yourself, how communism treats people, how they live their lives. I wish that there was a way to send you back in time to Soviet Russia in its early days, so you could live in a gulag camp and suffer from your ideology, because I can guarantee once you've lived under communism you wouldn't be supporting it anymore. And none of you people who say that communism is the greatest thing since sliced bread would want to live under its rule for any amount of time if you actually experienced it for yourself.
Is that they never seem to recognise any distinction between authoritarian and libertarian communism, assuming them to be the same thing. When we understand that they are not the same thing, there is of course no sense in wishing that libertarian communists be thrown into the gulags of Marxist-Leninist Russia in order to teach them what their own ideology is like, because of course Stalin was not a libertarian communist. There is an even sillier use of the word communist by the right, and that's simply a pejorative toward anything they don't like, such as Donald Trump Jr. calling Nike communist. That's Nike, the large multinational corporation that's worth $29.6 billion according to Forbes. Apparently that's communism according to Trump Jr. Obviously Nike is not communist. If you're annoyed with the behaviour of a large multinational company because of a decision they made to increase profits, then I'm afraid what you're annoyed with is capitalism. The same stands for the right-wing's current war on big tech, i.e. the various social media sites such as Twitter that have started shutting down authoritarian right accounts, most notably that of Donald Trump, following the attempted coup at the Capitol building. These companies are certainly not communist, given as they are privately owned and exist for the purposes of making profit. If you're frustrated with said companies, what you're frustrated with is called capitalism. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the right have been referring to the state of affairs in America as a trial period of communism. Again, no. America is a capitalist country. If you're frustrated with the way the pandemic is being handled in America, you are frustrated with capitalism, and you need to start accepting the reality of that. It is beyond immature to blame the failings of a capitalist society on communism. While we're on the subject of pejoratives, the right also have a habit of using the word Marxist to broadly refer to people on the left, and sometimes people on the right if their behaviour isn't deemed right enough. It's important to recognise the difference between this pejorative use of the word Marxist and the people who actually subscribe to the teachings of Karl Marx. The former is a label people have applied to them by people who don't like them. The latter is a label people apply to themselves. Even worse is the term cultural Marxist. I need to state here in no uncertain terms, there is no such thing as cultural Marxism. The belief that there is a conspiracy theory, one with some particularly disturbing roots. It's essentially a rebranding of cultural Bolshevism, a derogatory term used in Nazi propaganda to refer to the Frankfurt School, as admitted by the neo-Nazi website Stormfront. The popularity of this conspiracy theory can also be attributed in no small part to Holocaust denialists Bill Lind and Pat Buchanan, who alarmingly was once a presidential candidate in the US. The term cultural Marxist is therefore, of course, purely a pejorative. You are very unlikely to hear anyone refer to themselves as a cultural Marxist, except perhaps in jest. Worse though, it's a pejorative with roots in Nazism. If you are not a Nazi and want to engage in any kind of sensible discussion of politics, I strongly suggest you drop the term cultural Marxist from your vocabulary. Also similar is the way right-wingers use the word authoritarian to refer to people other than themselves. Even, and in some cases especially if said people subscribe to explicitly libertarian ideologies. This is of course simple projection, very much in the vein of Rothbard's appropriation of the word libertarian from the left. The word socialism also causes some considerable confusion. Both the authoritarian left and the libertarian left refer to themselves as socialists. However, as previously explained, what the former are referring to is a society where means of production are controlled by a state deemed to be capable of acting in the best interests of the workers, whereas the latter are referring to direct worker control of means of production. You may also notice the term democratic socialism has become a bit fashionable of late. The term, however, isn't new. Williams argues that the term originally gained popularity in the early 20th century as a way for those who considered themselves socialist but wished to clearly distinguish themselves from the very anti-democratic regimes of Marxist-Leninism, given as Marxist-Leninists also considered themselves to be socialists. Morelli argues that the likes of Bernie Sanders, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Elizabeth Warren, while they call themselves democratic socialists, are in fact social democrats. Whether or not this is true is entirely dependent upon whether they see social democracy as a stepping stone towards socialism or as a destination. Social democracy essentially describes a society with a capitalist economy but with lots of welfare and public services and where rich people pay their taxes. Just as the right often use the word communist in a dubious manner, they often do the same with the word socialist. Not just in the sense that they neglect to distinguish between the different types of socialism, although they certainly do that, but also the fact that they often claim that the Nazis were socialists. I need to state in no uncertain terms that the Nazis were not socialists. Right-wingers would argue that the word Nazi is an abbreviation of National Socialist, and therefore the Nazis were socialist because it's right there in the name. This rather obtuse reasoning, of course, falls flat when applied to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which of course is not a democracy, despite it being right there in the name. It should be pretty obvious when it comes to political parties, movements, states and ideologies that they don't always do what they say on the tin. In Nazi Germany, workers certainly did not control means of production. As I explained in the last video, the Nazis employed a mixture of heavy privatization and state control. As Bell explains, there was private initiative in the production process, but no private initiative was allowed in the distribution of the product. Owners can act freely within their firms, but face tight restrictions in the market. As Klein explains, the basis of the conflation of Nazism and socialism is the term National Socialism, a self-description of the Nazis. National Socialism includes the word socialism, but it is just a word. Hitler and the Nazis outlawed socialism and executed socialists and communists en masse, even before they started rounding up Jews. In 1933, the Dachau concentration camp held socialists and leftists exclusively. The Nazis arrested more than 11,000 Germans for illegal socialist activity in 1936. As Encyclopaedia Britannica put it, the party's socialist orientation was basically a demagogic gambit designed to attract support from the working class. It's pretty obvious, of course, that the claim by modern-day right-wingers that the Nazis were socialists is to insinuate that therefore socialists are Nazis, and people who identify as socialists should therefore be viewed with the same disgust as Nazis. Having once appropriated the word socialist, the right now seek to rid themselves of the word Nazi by palming it off onto the left. The appropriation of the word socialist is somewhat similar to Rothbard's appropriation of the word libertarian, i.e. right-wingers recognising left-wing terminology as being somehow more appealing to the masses and thus wanting it for themselves. I struggle to find examples of the reverse happening, i.e. left-wing individuals or groups attempting to appropriate right-wing terminology, which I think does tell us a lot about the honesty or lack thereof with which the left and the right communicate. You might also have heard the term leftism being used a lot in recent years, particularly on the internet. Leftism isn't really a thing. It's a term used by right-wingers to lump together a lot of very different ideologies, such as Marxist-Leninism, anarchism, social democracy, etc., due to them all being things the right don't like, and therefore assume to be much of a muchness. Obviously, even a cursory glance at political theory and history will reveal, as discussed earlier, that the differences between these ideologies are both real and very significant. The murdering of Hungarian anarchists by Marxist-Leninists in 1956 being one of the most stark examples. There are, of course, a significant number of people on the internet who self-identify as leftists. They are often young people who are somewhat new to political theory and who tend to see the internet as a massive virtual sixth form common room or high school lunchroom, with the leftists being one of the numerous cliques that occupies a certain amount of territory within said room. And of course, the more people they can convince to identify as leftists, the more people they'll have in their clique and the more space they'll get to occupy. As such, they spend very little, if any, of their time engaging in union activity or social activism, and instead spend most of their time forming unhealthy parasocial relationships with their favourite YouTubers, making excuses for the harmful behaviour of said YouTubers, watching live streams by said YouTubers, and trying to convince certain popular YouTubers with a documented history of racism, transphobia, and other such bigotries to identify as leftists in the hope that their popularity will speed along the process of trying to make leftism the biggest clique in the room, without thought for how hurtful and insulting this will be to people of colour or transgender or other marginalised people within their community. Self-identified leftists use the word leftist in pretty much the same way right-wingers do, to lump together a set of significantly and irreconcilably different political ideologies, as though said differences are neither non-existent or trivial, or things that can be addressed later. Needless to say, I would recommend not identifying as a leftist, and asking those who do identify as leftists to be more specific about their political beliefs, and to make sure the differences between anarchism and Marxist-Leninism, etc., don't go ignored. Another libertarian left term you might have heard is the term anarcho-syndicalist. Note Rothbard's earlier reference to left-wing anarchists of the communist or syndicalist variety, for example. Anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive. The former is essentially a strategy for achieving the latter via direct seizing of the means of production by labour unions, which would then form into a network with one another through which the distribution of wealth can be negotiated. Rudolf Rocker outlines this particular anarchist theory in his book Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice. So what about the term conservative? Conservative is a popular label for people on the right of the political square, and is a term that can be taken fairly literally. To be conservative is to want to keep things the way they are, i.e. to conserve them, in contrast of course to the word progressive. For example, a conservative might react negatively to any attempt to redistribute wealth and power, or any attempt to bring about socio-cultural change, e.g. making society more accommodating to LGBTQ people. Conservative is an apt word for those who fear change. All people probably are at least a bit conservative about at least a few things. Cecil argues there is a natural conservatism in every human mind. As a political identity, it tends to refer to people who oppose change broadly speaking. Although we do tend to use the word conservative and the term right-wing somewhat interchangeably, it's notable that the hard right aren't really trying to conserve society the way it is, but rather to regress society back to a supposed golden age when everything was better. See slogans such as "Make Germany Great Again" or "Make America Great Again." It is important to stress my use of the word supposed here. The golden age the hard right might propose a return to may well be an era they misremember, or may not even have been alive during, meaning their understanding of it may be filtered through the romanticism of folklore. Some people identify as fiscal conservatives or social conservatives specifically. Fiscal conservatism refers to being conservative only with regard to money. So, for example, a fiscal conservative might support social progress, such as LGBTQ rights, black and minority ethnic rights, feminism, disabled rights, etc., which a social conservative wouldn't, but oppose redistribution of wealth. There are contradictions with this stance, most notably that many LGBTQ people, black and minority ethnic people, women, disabled people, etc. are also poor, and as such can't fully benefit from a social progress that doesn't include wealth redistribution. But contrary or not, it is still a label that some people claim. People who are fiscally conservative are known both by themselves and others as capitalists. There are different types of capitalism, but what they all have in common is private control of means of production and the wealth there produced, i.e. privatisation. To look at the different types of capitalism, the most pure form of capitalism is the belief in complete privatisation of all aspects of society. Means of production are all controlled by private owners with no government to place restriction on how they control them. Labour unions are also not allowed in such a system, as the aim of such unions is to wrest some, if not all, control of means of production from the hands of private owners. Proponents of this type of capitalism like to call themselves anarcho-capitalists, as mentioned earlier. Moving a bit further away from the bottom right corner of the political diagram, you might encounter capitalists who profess a belief in what they call small government. Though as explained in the last video, a government that enforces private property rights is only a small government from the perspective of those rich enough to be able to privately own means of production. For those looking to unionise with their fellow workers, such a government would certainly not be small. Similarly, a government that enforces a private company's privilege to discriminate against certain customers, such as for example LGBTQ people, will not be a small government from the perspective of those being discriminated against. This is why, as I mentioned in the previous video, the word libertarian belongs very much in inverted commas in the case of the right-wing libertarianism, in that it doesn't really offer much in the way of liberty. While American proponents of this form of capitalism do tend to call themselves libertarians, in classical European economics it is known as liberalism. Retrospectively, it is nowadays known specifically as classical liberalism, given the rise of the 20th century of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, in contrast to the supposed small government of classical liberalism, is a form of capitalism where government takes a much more active role in the economy. For example, the Tory party of the UK, when they took power in 2010, began implementing what is known as austerity measures, i.e. they enacted legislation and policy that ensured the economy was working primarily in the interests of a select elite. This is sometimes derogatorily referred to as crony capitalism, for reasons that are hopefully self-explanatory. It was similar in 1990 when Margaret Thatcher made the decision to stop BT from rolling out microfibre cables for the UK communications network because she felt they would end up monopolising the market, going against her principle of a competitive market. Make no mistake, neoliberalism is very much a form of capitalism where the government takes a hands-on approach, not a laissez-faire one. People such as Paul Joseph Watson would do well to learn a bit more about the different types of capitalism, not least because he seems to consider himself to be an anarcho-capitalist, yet also sings the praises of capitalism that features a welfare state.
But even for those needy people who fall behind, capitalism provides a safety net via the welfare state, paid for by taxpayers as a result of wealth creation because of capitalism. The state punishes theft, yet engages in the rampant looting of society's productivity through taxation at the barrel of a gun.
Now, capitalism with a welfare state definitely isn't anarcho-capitalism. The clue is in the word state. Under anarcho-capitalism, absolutely everything is privatised and no one pays any taxes. There would be no such thing as a welfare state. Those out of work or unable to work due to disability would be entirely dependent upon the charity of those more fortunate. It's similarly contradictory to claim that capitalism is responsible for all the great things we have in the world, but also claim that capitalism has never existed. If capitalism has never existed, then capitalism isn't responsible for anything, good or bad. If you want to describe capitalism which is interfered with by the government as corporatism, well, as I explained a moment ago, that's actually what neoliberalism is. And neoliberalism is the dominant form of capitalism in the Western world, and has been for decades. If you want to hold the Western world up as some sort of shining example of how great you think capitalism is, you have to understand that that particular form of capitalism is one that involved and continues to involve a great deal of interference from the government. If you're American, all this talk of liberalism as a right-wing ideology might have you saying something like this.
He literally just painted every liberal as fucking conservative.
Yeah, this is an example of a cultural difference in how some labels are used. Americans, and a significant number of non-Americans who are often young and heavily influenced by American culture, tend to use the word liberal to refer to people who are a bit centre-left politically. It's what Rothbard was referring to when he said words such as liberal had been originally identified with laissez-faire libertarians, but had been captured by left-wing statists. This is in part due to the Overton window, i.e. the scope of political views that can be considered mainstream, in America being considerably different to the rest of the Western world. It's been joked that this is what the American Overton window looks like. So if that's the case, the most libertarian left views within the mainstream of American politics would be centre-right and centre-authoritarian by global standards. America doesn't really have a substantial left-wing movement. Its supposedly left-wing party, the Democrats, are unapologetic capitalists.
We're capitalists, and that's just the way it is.
Another confusion around the term liberal is that sometimes it refers to social liberty as well as economic liberty. So an American might refer to themselves as a liberal because they are fiscally conservative, i.e. they support privatisation, but are socially progressive, i.e. they support LGBTQ rights, black and minority ethnic rights, etc. As noted earlier, there are certain contradictions between being fiscally conservative and socially progressive, but often labels are statements of intent rather than outcome. This perhaps lends a lot of credence to something Assata Shakur once said, that liberal is the most meaningless word in the dictionary. When it comes to the word neoliberal specifically, though, there's really not much excuse for not knowing what that means.
So, like most people who grew up immersed in the neoliberal ideology of the West...
What? Neoliberal ideology of the West. Let's just break that one down for a moment, shall we? Neo, meaning new. Liberal, the idea that the world should be governed on a principle of liberty and equality for all people. And this is supposed to somehow be a bad thing to think.
Those who don't know, neoliberal is like your typical left-leaning social progressive, but also being generally pro-free market with few restrictions on a lot of industries like housing, but also very pro-welfare state, as libertarians would say. Neoliberals want a substantial safety net, often even supporting public options, like healthcare, for instance.
Now, in Unnatural Vegan's case, she's confusing neoliberalism with social democracy, presumably because that's a centre-left position and because Americans tend to use the word liberal as a term for the centre-left. In Teal Deer's case, I just think he's never heard the word neoliberal before and is assuming it's just some strange new SJW word that people like Anita Sarkeesian use. Worse, his attempt to figure out its meaning amounts to little more than the most facile and pedantic dismantling of its two components imaginable. It hasn't occurred to him to look it up or anything like that. This confusion around the word liberal would go some way to explaining why certain people have got it into their heads that Carl Benjamin is left-wing. That's Carl Benjamin who says things like this.
I'm just so goddamn sick of the left.
And who ran as a UKIP candidate in the European parliamentary election. Pretty obviously not left-wing by any stretch of the imagination, but he identifies as a classical liberal, which may well be where the confusion lies. Though when someone repeatedly says things like this...
I don't think Hitler was sadistic, okay? I don't think Adolf Hitler was a sadistic man.
It's a bit difficult to seriously forgive anyone for confusing this person for being in any way left-wing. Another label that is similarly fuzzy in its meaning is centrist. It's very difficult to ascertain what a person means when they identify as a centrist, and asking them for clarification doesn't always help. There is definitely a certain school of centrism that is simply based upon the logical fallacy of appeal to moderation, also known as the balance fallacy. As Dawkins explains, when two opposite points of view are expressed with equal force, the truth does not necessarily lie midway between them. It is possible for one side to be simply wrong, and that justifies passion on the other side. Indeed, the fact that left-wingers and right-wingers may be equally passionate about their political beliefs does not mean that they're both as bad as each other, and if you think they are, you must recognise that you have a burden of proof to meet, i.e. you need to provide evidence that each position is equally bad, and I must stress equally bad, not equally passionate or equally committed. Those are not the same thing. When such a centrist assumes they don't have a burden of proof and expects that their centrism be seen as reasonable simply by virtue of being in the middle, then they are employing the logical fallacy of appeal to moderation. I should note here that there's something of an irony in Dawkins defining the appeal to moderation as aptly as he does, because in practice he actually appeals to moderation himself on a number of issues, leading to some problematic stances. But that will be the subject of a future video. This brings up another problem with the notion of being centrist. Does the person identifying themselves as a centrist fully understand the full range of the political square? For example, if someone considers themselves centrist because they see the hard left as dictators like Joseph Stalin and the hard right as dictators like Adolf Hitler, this strongly suggests that they are only familiar with the left-to-right political axis and not the libertarian to authoritarian axis. Without a comprehensive knowledge of the full range of political extremes, how does one determine they are in the centre of it all? Another example of this would be Americans who consider themselves centrist because they find themselves in equal amounts of agreement and disagreement with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The problem here is that those two parties do not represent anything close to the full range of political extremes. As mentioned earlier, both parties are capitalist. Both parties also have policies that are racist and xenophobic. If you find yourself midway between these two parties, you have to understand that on a global scale, this doesn't really qualify you as a centrist. The fact that such people do consider themselves centrist highlights the dangers both of failing to understand the world much beyond our own culture, and also of limiting our consideration of politics to the ever-shifting Overton window. Similarly, in the UK, the Liberal Democrat Party is considered centrist as it occupies a political position between the Labour Party on the left and the Tory Party on the right. What's notable, though, is that following the hung parliament of the 2010 UK general election, the Liberal Democrats had the choice of either forming a coalition government with the Labour Party or the Tory Party. They chose the latter. Incidents like this can tell us a great deal about whether centrists are centre-left or centre-right. Whenever centrists talk of the wonder of compromise, it's important to take careful note of who they are compromising with. I do find it very hard to believe that anyone is central on literally every political issue. A jab often aimed at centrists is that they only want to exterminate half the Jews, given as that would be the central position between the hard authoritarian right, who would exterminate all Jews, and the hard libertarian left, who would exterminate the zero Jews, and would try and stop anyone who intended to exterminate any Jews. Centrists obviously object to this characterization, but it does bring up the obvious question of how they can consider themselves centrist given those political extremes. Some centrists might explain that they are centrist not because they are in the middle on every issue, but rather that they agree with the left on some issues and with the right on others. So, for example, they might completely agree with the libertarian left stance on completely opposing any form of genocide, but perhaps agree with the right on other issues. I'm not entirely convinced this makes a person centrist. If you agree with the authoritarian right on a certain issue, the libertarian left will argue with you exactly the same way they argue with someone who is authoritarian right on every issue. In practice, for that argument at least, you are authoritarian right. There is also the problem of how compatible these left-wing and right-wing beliefs our centrist claims to possess are. As mentioned earlier, if a person considers themselves socially progressive but fiscally conservative, they will run into contradictions on matters such as supporting transgender people. As a social progressive, they will acknowledge the gender identity of trans people and will support their right to have reassignment surgery if they so desire. However, as a fiscal conservative, they won't support universal healthcare. As such, trans people will have to privately fund their own surgery. This limits our centrists' support for trans people to financially well-off trans people. So from the perspective of a financially not so well-off trans person, our centrist will not appear quite so central, given as they've not merely ignored a barrier faced by said trans person, but actively supported it. So what we've looked at here mainly is labels that refer to economic policies people might have, though we have looked a bit at social politics. Let's look at that some more. A popular socio-political label you might hear is feminist. Now, it's important to note that when liberals, left libertarians and left authoritarians call themselves feminists, while there is some definite overlap between these different feminisms, they are significantly different. All three would typically define feminism as the belief in gender equality, and as such have a lot of common ground when tackling issues such as sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, reproductive rights, gender roles and stereotypes, the depiction of genders in media, etc., etc. We do start to notice differences, though, when we look in more detail. Liberals, left libertarians and left authoritarians might all consider their feminism intersectional, though whether they are is questionable. Intersectionality is often misunderstood to mean opposing racism as well as sexism, or opposing transphobia as well as sexism, etc., etc. It's actually a bit more than that. Intersectional feminists don't merely oppose other prejudices as well as sexism, they recognise that these prejudices are intertwined. As Lickey puts it, intersectional interplays between categorisations should be analysed as mutual and intertwined processes of transformation, and not as a mere addition of gender, class, ethnicity, race, sexuality, and so on. While liberals might consider their feminism intersectional because they recognise the intertwining of sexism with other issues such as racism and transphobia, left libertarians would note that liberals are capitalists. Therefore, they support a society that has a class system, and as such their efforts to challenge sexism will not benefit working class women as much as they benefit middle class and upper class women. Put simply, whereas both liberals and left libertarians would recognise that the majority of CEOs are men, the former might propose, therefore, there should be more women CEOs, whereas the latter would argue that there should be no CEOs, and that all means of production should be controlled by the workers directly. The feminism of the libertarian left is typically known as anarcha-feminism, and it should not be confused with liberal feminism. Because of the intersectional interplay between classism and racism, liberal feminism has a significant amount of overlap with something called white feminism. It's important to note here that the term white feminist doesn't simply refer to a feminist who is white, rather it refers to someone whose approach to tackling sexism ignores the intersectional interplay between sexism and racism. Put simply, it's an approach that aims to challenge the privilege men have over women, but not the privilege white women have over black and minority ethnic women. Because black and minority ethnic people in the Western world are overrepresented among the poor, more women CEOs inevitably means more white middle class and upper class women CEOs. There's a similar clash between anarcho-feminists and any feminists who support the existence of the state, which would be both liberal feminists and authoritarian left feminists. The latter might recognise the male domination of positions within government and argue that there should be more women in office. Anarcho-feminists, however, just as they oppose the oppression of privatisation, also oppose the oppression of the state. So just as they don't see more women CEOs as the solution to male dominance of corporate power, they don't see more women in office as the solution to male dominance of state power. As Flick puts it, anarchist feminists see the state as an institution of patriarchy and seek to find a way out of the alienation of the contemporary world and the impersonal nature of the state and its rituals of economic, physical and psychological violence. Another label to discuss here is the word TERF. TERF stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist and refers to those who refuse to accept trans women as women. This refusal means that TERFs exclude trans women from what they deem to be women's spaces, and often harass trans women both on and offline. They often espouse paranoid notions that trans women are just men looking to subversively infiltrate women's spaces, and often refuse to refer to trans women with female pronouns. It would be difficult to accurately place TERFs on the political square. When discussing issues beside trans rights, they often sound quite progressive. However, when the issue is trans rights, their rhetoric is barely distinguishable from that of the authoritarian right, even going so far as to actively work with the authoritarian right to use state power to oppress transgender people. Needless to say, TERFs are definitely not intersectional feminists. Because of the negative reputation of the word TERF, many TERFs have chosen to rebrand themselves in recent years as gender-critical feminists. Critics of TERFs have also chosen to rebrand them as trans-exclusionary reactionary fuckwits, considering the TERF rhetoric to be neither radical nor feminist. A similar label is SWERF, Sex Worker Exclusionary Radical Feminist. SWERFs are ardently opposed to sex work of any kind, believing it to be inherently oppressive to women. They often back this up with reference to the sex trafficking of women. However, when faced with the existence of women who actively choose to be sex workers, they argue that this choice is inauthentic and a result of these women being indoctrinated by a patriarchal society. This attitude, of course, makes their activism inaccessible to women who are willingly sex workers. SWERFs, like TERFs, therefore are also not intersectional feminists. Both TERFism and SWERFism have roots in something called political lesbianism, which is an ideology which asserts that women should consciously reject heterosexuality. Political lesbians believe men are the enemy, heterosexual women are collaborators with the enemy. This rejection of heterosexuality puts them at obvious odds with sex workers who service male clientele. Their strict rejection of heterosexuality typically necessitates a very strict belief in gender as a fixed binary, putting them at odds with transgender people. Their rejection of heterosexuality can also make them hyper-suspicious as to the authenticity of trans women, hence TERFism. Political lesbians are often not actual lesbians, simply women who choose not to act on any attraction they might feel towards men. They have been criticised by LGBTQ people for their appropriation of the word lesbian as a political identity, their biphobia and their transphobia. Although feminism is generally understood to mean the belief in gender equality, obviously that's not really the case with feminisms such as TERFism, SWERFism and political lesbianism, in that they generally assert the superiority of cis women over all else. It's important to note that, like socialists, communists, etc., feminists are not a monolith. They have distinct and significant differences both in their beliefs and the activism informed by those beliefs. A failure to recognise this is what often leads to very crude and inaccurate criticisms being made against feminism. Just as Rothbard gloated about free market capitalists appropriating the word libertarian from the left, there have been a couple of attempts to similarly appropriate the word feminist as well, though nothing quite so successful. Christina Hoff Sommers makes content for the right-wing think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, calling herself the factual feminist, though predictably echoing clearly anti-feminist talking points. While anti-feminists clearly appreciate her content and openly sing its praises, they don't appreciate it quite enough to actually start calling themselves factual feminists or equity feminists or such similar. Unlike the word libertarian, I don't think the word feminist is quite as malleable to opportunistic right-wingers. It's one thing to contort the word libertarian to refer to the free market rather than the free people. It's quite another to contort the word feminist to refer to misogynists rather than opponents of misogyny. This clip is pretty much what seals it.
I've taken some time out of my busy schedule, being fabulous and doing my hair, to prepare a speech for you. Well, a few remarks, really. Feminism is cancer. Thank you very much.
What Milo...
Please, if you would sit down.
What Milo meant to say, what I am going to explain, you will be pleased. What Milo meant to say is that feminism, while being a noble and valiant, courageous movement, there are certain schools of thought that are somewhat unwholesome. Right, Milo?
No, I meant it was cancer.
Returning to the subjects of anarcho-feminism and intersectionality, while it would be nice to think that those who consider themselves libertarian left were all supportive of anarcho-feminism, sadly this is not the case. Just as white feminists are quick to recognise the privilege men have over women, but not the privilege white women have over black and minority ethnic women, some socialists are quick to recognise the privilege the upper and middle class have over the working class, but not the privilege working class men have over working class women. Such people are also similarly dismissive of the intersections between the LGBTQ and the working class, and black and minority ethnic people and the working class, and basically any intersection of any other oppressed group with the working class. This mentality is known as class reductionism, though it is also known sometimes as brocialism or monarchism. What's important to remember here is that if socialism is supposed to be a movement for workers seizing control of means of production, it surely needs to be a movement for all workers. So it must be inclusive to women and other oppressed groups. It's important to remember that anarchism means no rulers, while in economic terms this means no privatisation and no state. When it comes to social politics, it should also reject the rule of men over women, i.e. patriarchy, the rule of white people over black and minority ethnic people, i.e. white supremacy, and essentially any other form of unjustifiable hierarchy. At this point I want to return to discussion of the authoritarian right. They use many labels. We've already discussed the word Nazi. The word fascist is another well-known one, historically most associated with the party of Benito Mussolini in Italy between 1922 and 1943, but also with the regime of Francisco Franco, dictator of Spain between 1939 and 1975. There are some modern right authoritarians who actively embrace these sorts of labels. Don Black, founder of the website Stormfront, would be a good example. He openly identifies as a neo-Nazi and was a member of the American Nazi Party in the 1970s. A lot of right authoritarians are sneakier in their use of labels, however. They recognise labels such as Nazi and fascist as off-putting, so not only refrain from applying them to themselves, but also have a habit of palming them off onto their political opponents. A good example of the latter would be the attempt to argue that Nazis were socialists, discussed earlier, or Rush Limbaugh's coining of the word feminazi. Labels such as race realism, alt-right, Proud Boys, the English Defence League, the British National Party, and so on are all attempts to rebrand the authoritarian right to audiences who are all too aware of the negative connotations of words like Nazi and fascist. It doesn't take a lot of investigation, of course, to reveal the authoritarian right nature of these groups, but the rebranding is just subtle enough that it allows them a little bit more charity from people. Such attempts to pass authoritarian right ideology under people's radar are known as crypto-fascism. The overarching lesson of this video: when you hear someone apply a label to themselves or to someone else, make sure you know what it means. Take into account the cultural and historical context. Take into account any qualifiers that might accompany that label. Ask yourself, what does this person actually believe? Failure to do this causes a lot of miscommunication.